Daniel Carter grabbed the man's wrist hard 1 second before the needle touched Victoria Sterling's neck. Nobody saw it happen. The music was loud. The champagne was flowing. 400 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits, laughing, clinking glasses, celebrating the most powerful woman in the room. Nobody was watching the driver. They never watched the driver. The man in the catering uniform froze. His eyes went wide. And in that single breathless moment, Daniel leaned in close and said 5 quiet words that made the color drain completely from the man's face. What those words were, you'll find out before this story ends. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. You will not want to miss what happens next. The morning it all began, Daniel Carter was 45 minutes early. How was always early? Not because anyone told him to be. Not because the job required it, but because old habits from a different life. A life most people at Sterling Global knew absolutely nothing about had rewired something deep inside him. When you spent years in places where being 5 minutes late meant someone didn't come home, you stopped being capable of being casual about time. He sat behind the wheel of the black company SUV in the parking structure beneath Sterling Global's downtown Chicago headquarters, a cup of gas station coffee cooling in the cup holder beside him, reading nothing, just watching. That was the other thing people didn't understand about Daniel. Most people, when they had nothing to do, pulled out their phones, scrolled, checked messages, let their eyes go soft and unfocused. Daniel watched. He watched the parking attendant, who took a 15-minute break at the same time every morning, but had been taking 12-minute breaks for the past week. He watched the delivery truck that always arrived at 7:40 and had started arriving at 7:20. He watched the way the security camera on the east side of Level 2 had developed a slight tilt just 3 degrees off that nobody on the security team seemed to notice or care about. Small things. Invisible things. The kind of things that didn't matter until suddenly they were the only things that mattered. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Lily. Dad. Don't forget my science project is due. Thursday. Okay? Mrs. Patterson said no extensions, this time for real. He smiled before he could stop himself. Typed back. I remember. I've been remembering since you told me 10 days ago. And 8 days ago. And yesterday. Lily, just making sure. Lily. I love you. Daniel, I love you more. I'll be home by 7. Don't eat cereal for dinner again. Lily, no promises. He locked the phone. Set it face down. Let the smile stay on his face for exactly 3 more seconds. Then it was gone. And he was watching again. Victoria Sterling arrived at 8:02, which meant she was running late by her own standards. She moved fast. She always moved fast. Heels clicking against the concrete, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, and her phone pressed to her ear, nodding at whatever the person on the other end was saying, without breaking stride. Daniel was out of the car before she reached the vehicle. Door open. Ready. She glanced at him, the way people glance at furniture. They've had so long they stop seeing it anymore. Morning, Daniel. Good morning, Ms. Sterling. She got in. He closed the door, got behind the wheel, pulled out. That was their morning ritual. It had been their morning ritual for 4 months. And in 4 months, that was approximately the depth of every conversation they had ever had. Which was fine with Daniel. He wasn't there to make friends. From the rearview mirror, tilted at an angle. Most drivers never bothered to calibrate correctly. But Daniel had adjusted on his first day. He could see her working. She was always working. Reading documents, making calls, reviewing numbers on a tablet that she held. Like most people hold a steering wheel with both hands, like letting go would cause a crash. Victoria Sterling was 32 years old, and she ran a company that employed 11,000 people across 6 countries. She'd inherited it 2 years ago, when her father died suddenly, and by every account that Daniel had read, because yes, he had read every account, she had not just held it together, but made it stronger. She was sharp. She was driven. She trusted data over emotion, results over relationships, and strategy over instinct. All of which Daniel had concluded quietly made her exactly the kind of person who was going to have a very hard time believing what he'd spent the last 3 months watching unfold. His eyes moved to the side mirror. There it was. The silver sedan. 2 cars back. It had been there yesterday morning too. And the morning before that. Different driver, he'd clocked that much, but the same plates. Illinois registration. Commercial. The kind of plates that were easy to spoof if you knew how. He said nothing. Just noted it. Filed it. And kept driving. The first time Daniel tried to say something, it didn't go the way he'd hoped. He'd been at Sterling Global for 6 weeks. Long enough to trust what he was seeing. Long enough to know that the pattern wasn't coincidence. He'd gone to the head of corporate security, a man named Richard Holt, former Chicago PD, big handshake, bigger ego, and he'd laid it out simply. The vehicle surveillance, the access schedule anomalies, the fact that 3 different vendors with limited clearance had been observed in areas of the building they had no legitimate business being in. Richard Holt had listened, nodded, and then he'd done something Daniel hadn't expected from a former law enforcement officer. He laughed. Not the polite, dismissive kind of laugh. The actual, genuine, this is funny to me kind of laugh. "Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair with the comfortable authority of a man who believed his desk was a throne. "You drive a car. Your job is to drive a car. I've got a team of 12 trained security professionals whose entire job is to monitor threats to this company. You think a driver spotted something my team missed?" Daniel kept his voice level. "I think it's worth looking into. I think," Holt said, "that you should focus on whatever it is drivers focus on. Routes, schedules, gas prices." He smiled. "And leave the security to people who understand security." Daniel stood up. Understood. He walked out of that office, and he never went back to Richard Holt again. But he didn't stop watching. The second time he tried it was with a junior analyst named Marcus Webb, a 26-year-old who actually seemed to pay attention to things, who Daniel had noticed spent more hours in the office than anyone except Victoria herself, and who had the look of someone who hadn't yet learned to stop caring. Daniel caught him alone by the coffee station on the 14th floor, 2 weeks after the conversation with Holt. "I need to show you something," Daniel said quietly. He had his phone out, not the company-issued one, his personal one, and on it was a collection of photographs he'd taken himself. Timestamps, license plates, faces he'd captured through the windshield at angles that looked accidental but weren't. "I've been tracking this for about 2 months. Something's not right around Ms. Sterling's schedule and movements." Marcus looked at the photos. His forehead creased. "Where'd you get these?" "I took them." "You?" Marcus looked up, back down at the phone. "Back up. You're the driver." "Yes." "You've been—" He lowered his voice without being asked, which Daniel appreciated. "You've been doing surveillance, on your own. Why?" "Because I noticed something and nobody else seemed to." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He scrolled through the photos slowly, the way someone does when their brain is working faster than their hands. Then he stopped on one particular image, the silver sedan shot through the driver's side mirror, the passenger side window down just far enough to reveal the outline of someone with a camera. "That's pointed at the building," Marcus said. "It's pointed at the east entrance, the entrance Ms. Sterling uses 80% of the time. Have you told anyone about this?" "I told Holt 6 weeks ago." Marcus's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite surprise. "What did he say?" "He told me to worry about gas prices." A pause. "Okay," Marcus said slowly. He handed the phone back, looking like a man deciding whether to step onto a ledge. "Okay. I'm going to look into some things, quietly. Don't mention this conversation to anyone." He started to walk away, then stopped. "What's your name again?" "Daniel. Carter." Marcus nodded once. "Stay heads up, Daniel." It was the first time in 4 months that anyone at Sterling Global had spoken to him like he was actually there. Lily was 9 years old, and she asked too many questions, which Daniel considered one of her very best qualities. That evening, while he reheated leftover chicken from the night before, and she sat at the kitchen table doing homework, she looked up at him with the particular expression she wore when she'd been thinking about something for a while, and had decided it was finally time to ask. "Dad, is your job dangerous?" He set 2 plates on the table. "I drive a car." "That's not what I asked." He sat down. Looked at her. This kid, this 9-year-old, who looked exactly like her mother and asked questions exactly like her mother, had always been too perceptive for comfortable parenting. Why are you asking? Because you look different when you come home now than you did when you started. She said it simply, like a fact. You look like you're still paying attention to something. Daniel was quiet for a moment. My job is to keep someone safe, he said, and right now I'm making sure I know how to do that. The lady you drive, the boss lady. Her name is Ms. Sterling, and yes. Lily picked up her fork. Considered this. Is she nice? She's very focused. That means no. That means she has a lot on her plate and she's working through it. Are you going to keep her safe? He met his daughter's eyes across the table. 9 years old, still believed that her father could do anything. Still trusted it the way she trusted that the sun would come up. Yes, he said. That's the plan. Good. She stabbed a piece of chicken. Because you're really good at keeping people safe, Dad, even when they don't know you're doing it. He didn't answer, just started eating. But later that night, after Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he sat at the small desk in his bedroom with his laptop open and a notepad beside it, and he worked. Cross-referencing names against contractor records, running what checks he could run through channels that technically no longer existed, but that a man like Daniel Carter would always have access to. Mapping patterns the way he'd been trained to map them. He'd been doing this every night for 3 months, and what was taking shape on that notepad was not something he could ignore. 3 weeks before the annual company gala, Daniel got his first confirmation that he wasn't seeing shadows. Marcus Webb found him in the parking structure at the end of the day. The analyst looked like he hadn't slept properly in a week, and the folder he was carrying had the careful, deliberate weight of something that had taken real effort to put together. I need you to listen to me carefully, Marcus said, speaking low and fast, because I only have about 2 minutes before someone notices I'm not at my desk. He opened the folder. Inside printed records, access logs, a series of transaction records that had been routed through 3 different subsidiary accounts. You were right. Something's being coordinated. There are at least 2 people inside the company I can't verify yet, who but the access patterns point to senior level, who have been passing information about Ms. Sterling's schedule and personal holdings to someone outside. Daniel looked at the records. For how long? I think at least 8 months, maybe longer. Marcus's jaw was tight. This isn't corporate espionage. The financial routing doesn't look like theft. It looks like someone's building a case to remove her. Forcibly, not through a board vote. The air in the parking structure felt suddenly colder. What's the timeline? Daniel asked. The activity has been accelerating. Whatever they're planning, I think they're planning to do it soon. Marcus closed the folder. I've been trying to figure out who to take this to. Internal legal is compromised. I found 2 conflicts of interest in 30 minutes of looking. Holt's security team. He stopped himself. What about Holt's team? Daniel asked carefully. Marcus looked at him. One of the access anomalies I found traces back to credentials that were logged under Holt's administrator code. Daniel said nothing. Let it sit. Then, does she know Ms. Sterling? I don't think so. Has anyone told her? I'm telling you. Why me? Marcus paused, seemed to be searching for words. Because you're the only person in this building I trust right now. Because you clearly already knew something was wrong before anyone else did. And because, he paused again, because whoever you are before you were a driver, I think you're exactly the person this situation needs. Daniel took the folder. Go back to your desk, he said quietly. Act normal. Don't look into this further tonight. I'll reach out to you. What are you going to do? Daniel tucked the folder under his arm and turned toward his car. The only thing I can do, he said. Make sure she makes it to the gala. He drove her the next morning without saying a word. Watched the silver sedan in the mirror. A different car today, dark blue, but the same pattern, same distance, same discipline of surveillance, and kept his face neutral and his hands easy on the wheel. Victoria was on a call for most of the drive. Something about a quarterly projection that wasn't landing the way she needed it to. Her voice had that edge it got when she was dealing with people who were giving her data she already knew wasn't right. "That number doesn't account for the European restructuring," she said sharply. "Run it again. I want the corrected figures before noon." A pause. "I understand it's a lot to ask. I'm asking anyway." She ended the call. Silence for a moment. And then, without looking up from her tablet, "Daniel." "Yes, ma'am." "How long have you been with the company now?" He glanced at the mirror. She was still looking at her tablet. 4 months, ma'am." "Do you enjoy the work?" An unusual question. Not a usual morning. He kept his voice even. "It suits me." A beat of silence. Then, "I've been told you spoke with Richard Holt a few months ago, about some concerns." His hands didn't move on the wheel. "Yes, ma'am. He mentioned it in passing last week." Her voice was careful. "He described the conversation as a misunderstanding. He's entitled to his opinion." "Are you still concerned?" He let a second pass. Just one. Then, "I think you should be careful around the gala next month." She looked up from the tablet. Met his eyes in the rearview mirror for the first time, really looked the way she looked at balance sheets when the numbers weren't adding up the way they should. "Why?" "Because I've been watching," he said simply. She studied his reflection for a long moment. He could see her processing it, the driver who flagged something to Holt, the driver who'd been quiet for 4 months, the driver who was now telling her to be careful. "I have a full security detail at that event," she said. "I know. Richard Holt has been managing corporate security for 9 years. "I know." "So why," she said slowly, "should I be concerned?" He pulled into the drop-off lane in front of the building, put the car in park, turned, which he almost never did, and looked at her directly. "Because the threat isn't coming from outside, Ms. Sterling. It's already inside. And some of the people whose job it is to protect you are part of the reason you need protecting." Victoria Sterling was a woman who had built a reputation on not showing surprise. She showed a little now. Just a little. "I want to show you something," Daniel said. "When you have time. Not here. Not in the building. Somewhere private." She looked at him for a long moment. "Friday," she said. "After my 7 o'clock. I'll have 20 minutes. 20 minutes is enough." She got out of the car. He watched her walk through the building's front doors without looking back, and in the dark blue car, 3 vehicles behind where he'd been parked, a man with a phone held just below the window line, finished typing a message and waited for the reply. Daniel saw him. He saw everything. That evening he tucked Lily in and sat on the edge of her bed, the way he had since she was small, since the years when he was home for stretches of time between deployments, and he'd made himself a promise that when he was there, he would be there completely every night, no matter what was waiting on the other side of tomorrow. She was already half asleep. He could see it in the slow drift of her eyelids, the way her breathing was just starting to even out. "Dad," she murmured. "Yeah, baby. You're going to be careful, right?" He thought about a parking structure, a folder full of names, a silver sedan, and a dark blue car, and a woman who was surrounded by enemies she had no idea existed yet. "Always," he said. "Promise." He put his hand over hers on the blanket. "Promise." She closed her eyes. He sat there for another minute in the dark, listening to her breathe the way he'd learned to count his blessings in the quiet moments between everything else. Then he got up. He had more work to do. Friday came. The 20 minutes Victoria gave him would change everything she thought she knew about the man who drove her car. But that is where part 2 begins. Friday arrived the way important days always do, quietly, without warning, dressed like any other morning. Daniel was already in position when Victoria's last meeting of the day ended at 7:18 p.m. He'd been waiting since 6:45, not because he was anxious, but because waiting was something he'd long ago turned into a discipline. You didn't get restless when you waited. You got sharper. He stood near the service elevator on the executive floor, away from the main corridor, where Holt's security cameras had the best coverage. He'd mapped the blind spots weeks ago. 3 of them on this floor alone. Not because he'd needed them then, because he'd known he might need them eventually. Victoria came out of the conference room with her portfolio under her arm and her jacket still buttoned, which meant the meeting had run formal all the way to the end. She saw him standing there, and her stride didn't break, but something behind her eyes shifted a small recalibration, like a woman who had spent all day trusting her own read of situations and was now quietly questioning it. "Walk with me," she said. He fell into step beside her. Not behind her. Beside. She didn't comment on it. They moved toward the northeast stairwell. The one Daniel had suggested 2 days earlier, via a handwritten note, slipped under the door of her private executive restroom. The only space in the building, he was reasonably certain wasn't monitored by anyone except the building's independent fire safety system. The note had said, "Northeast Stairwell 720, come alone. Don't mention this to anyone on your security team. She'd come alone." That told him something important about Victoria Sterling. When the data pointed somewhere uncomfortable, she didn't look away. She walked toward it. He respected that more than he'd expected to. The stairwell door closed behind them with a sound like a vault. The noise of the building disappeared. It was just the two of them and the low hum of the ventilation system and the stack of information. Daniel had spent 96 hours organizing into something a person could understand in 20 minutes. He handed her the folder. She opened it without preamble, started reading. He gave her time. Watched the floor. Listened to the stairwell above and below them out of pure instinct, cataloging every sound, every shift in air pressure, the way you do when your brain has been rewired to treat silence as something that requires constant verification. 2 minutes in, Victoria turned a page and stopped. She looked up at him. "This is Richard Holt's administrator code," she said. Her voice was completely flat, the kind of flat that means something is being held very carefully in place. "Yes. On an after-hours access log. For the server room that houses your personal calendar, your residential security system integration, and your vehicle tracking." She looked back down, kept reading. He watched the muscles in her jaw tighten with each page the way a person's face tightens when the structure they've built their sense of safety on is quietly being taken apart in front of them. At page 7, she stopped again. "James Whitfield." She said the name like it tasted wrong. "He's been with my father's company for 14 years. He ran the Singapore expansion personally. I've had dinner with his family." Daniel said nothing. He'd learned long ago that the worst betrayals didn't need commentary. They needed space. Victoria closed the folder. Not because she was done. Because she needed a moment before she kept going. He could see her working through it, not the emotion, but the logic. What it meant. How far it reached. What it changed. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "I've been building it for 3 months. The final confirmation came 5 days ago. You've been building this for 3 months." She said it slowly, repeating it not as a question, but as something she was pressing her thumb against to test its weight. "While driving my car." "Yes." She looked at him the way people look at something they've walked past every day, and suddenly realized they never actually saw. "Who are you?" He let one beat of silence pass. Then he said, "Right now, I'm the person who needs you to trust me for the next 3 weeks. The rest can come later." She studied him. Long enough that most people would have shifted, looked away, offered something to fill the quiet. Daniel stood still. He was good at stillness. "The gala," she said. "They've been building to it for months. The venue, the guest list, the security layout, all of it plays in their favor. There are going to be more than 400 people in that room. Holt's team controls the access points, and at least one of the people you trust most is going to be standing right beside you." "James?" "I believe so, yes." She pulled in a slow breath through her nose. Let it out. And then she did something that surprised him. She didn't panic, didn't reach for her phone, didn't start making moves out of fear, the way most people did when the ground dropped out from under them. She got very still and very focused, the way a person gets when they've decided to think before they act, which was Daniel had observed increasingly rare. "What do you need from me?" she asked. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a second smaller envelope. Inside was a handwritten list, 7 items. I need you to keep your schedule exactly as planned. Don't change anything. Don't cancel anything. Don't give them any signal that you know. I need access to the gala's venue layout, specifically the service contractor list and the secondary security plan that Holt's team filed with building management. She nodded once. I can get you that without going through Holt. I need to know who on your personal staff you trust absolutely, not professionally, personally. She thought about it. My assistant, Carla Reyes. She's been with me since before I took over the company. She's the only one who has my personal cell number and my mother's contact information. No one else. A pause. Honest. No one else. Carla is enough. He put the envelope away. One more thing. What? He looked at her directly. From this moment forward, I need you to stop treating me like your driver. She held his gaze. What should I treat you like? Like the only person between you and what's coming. The stairwell was quiet. Somewhere 3 floors below them, a door opened and closed. Neither of them moved. Then Victoria Sterling straightened her jacket, tucked the folder under her arm and said, I'll have the contractor list to you by Sunday. How do I reach you? He told her. She memorized it. Didn't write it down. And they walked back out into the building like two people who had just had an ordinary end-of-day conversation, because that was exactly what everyone watching the cameras needed to believe. The 20 minutes she'd given him had run to 34. She hadn't mentioned it. Neither had he. That night, Daniel called his sister in Ohio, the only person outside of his own head who knew the full shape of his life, and told her that if anything happened in the next 3 weeks, she was his emergency contact for Lily, and she should not try to reach him. She should just go get his daughter from school and stay there until he called. His sister, who had been through enough of Daniel's deployments to know what that kind of call meant, said, Are you going to be all right? I'm going to try very hard to be. Daniel, I love you. Tell Lily I'll be home for dinner tomorrow. I'm making that chicken thing she likes. He hung up before she could say anything else he'd have to carry. Then he sat at his desk and he went back to work. The next morning, the dark blue car was gone from its usual position. That should have felt like relief. Instead, Daniel felt the back of his neck go tight in the specific way it had learned to go tight. When something that had been visible stopped being visible, which wasn't the same as it stopping. Things didn't stop just because you couldn't see them anymore. They moved. He drove Victoria to 3 meetings and a lunch that day. She was perfect. Gave away nothing. Laughed at the right moments, made eye contact with the right people, sat next to James Whitfield at the lunch, and talked about Singapore, like the man hadn't potentially signed her name to something dangerous. She was, Daniel realized watching her through the rearview mirror, a genuinely extraordinary performer. Not fake, she just understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was control what people knew about what you knew. I understood that better than most. On the drive back from the lunch, she waited until they were at a red light, a long one, 2 minutes minimum. He'd clocked that intersection before, and she said quietly without looking up from her tablet, Whitfield was asking about the security arrangements for the gala again today. 3rd time this week. What did you tell him? That Holt had everything under control. Good. It made me feel sick to say it. I know. Keep saying it anyway. She said nothing for a beat. Then, the contractor list is in your personal email. Carla sent it from her private account. I got it. Did you find anything? He had in fact found 3 things on that list that had kept him up until 2 in the morning. A catering company with a service address that matched one of the plates he'd photographed. A security subcontractor whose foreman had a name that appeared in the access logs Marcus had pulled. And an equipment vendor whose employee records, when run through channels that Daniel technically should not have had access to anymore, but did show a registered agent who was connected to a financial structure that led back through 4 degrees of separation to a holding company that James Whitfield sat on the advisory board of. I'm working on it, he said. She accepted that. What do I do for the next 2 weeks? You keep going. You give them every reason to believe you have no idea. You show up to every event, every meeting, every dinner. You let them think they have the timing right. He paused. And you stay inside 30 feet of me whenever possible without making it obvious. She almost laughed. Almost. You drive a car, Daniel. I drive your car, he said. There's a difference. The light changed. He drove. That evening, he picked Lily up from her after-school program, and she talked the entire drive home about a girl named Priya, who had apparently done something at recess that was either deeply unfair or deeply funny, depending on which part of Lily's face he was looking at. He listened, asked questions, laughed at the right moments, helped her with the science project for 45 minutes after dinner, cutting apart a cardboard box and explaining the water cycle in terms a 9-year-old could understand, and then re-explaining it when she told him his first explanation was too much like a textbook. When she was asleep, he sat at his desk. When he was at his desk, he found Marcus Webb. Marcus had been quiet for 10 days. They'd agreed he would go dark to avoid attention, and Daniel had not pushed. But tonight, he needed to check in because the contractor lead had opened up a door, and Daniel needed someone inside the building to help him confirm what was on the other side. He texted from a number Marcus didn't have yet. Identified himself in a way that only someone who'd had their previous conversation would understand. Gave him 3 specific records to pull. Told him to route it through a method they'd discussed. Marcus responded in 11 minutes. That was a good sign. 11 minutes meant he'd been waiting for contact. That either meant he was worried or he had something. As it turned out, it was both. The message came through in pieces. Fragments the way Marcus communicated when he was being careful about what digital trace he left. But assembled together, it told Daniel something that made him set down his coffee cup and not pick it up again. Richard Holt was not just negligent. He was active. There was a payment, not through the company, not through anything that would show up in a standard audit, routed through a personal account that Marcus had found by following an anomaly in the petty cash reconciliation that everyone else had treated as a rounding error. The payment had come in 6 weeks ago. The amount was not large enough to be dramatic. It was exactly large enough to be a down payment on cooperation. And the date of the payment was 3 days after Daniel had walked into Holt's office and told him what he'd been watching. He stared at the screen. Holt hadn't laughed at him because he thought Daniel was wrong. Holt had laughed at him because Holt already knew. The laugh wasn't dismissal. It was performance. It was a man buying himself the look of someone who didn't take the threat seriously because the most dangerous thing that could happen to the operation was someone on the inside figuring out that the outside already had eyes on it. Daniel had walked in there and told Holt exactly what he knew. And Holt had walked out of that meeting and almost certainly told someone else, which meant they knew Daniel had been watching. They'd known for 6 weeks, and they'd let him keep his job, keep driving, keep existing in proximity to Victoria, because they'd decided he wasn't a real threat. They thought he was just a driver. He sat with that for a long time. There was a version of that realization that would make a man feel stupid, feel burned, feel like he should have seen it sooner. Daniel had been in enough impossible situations to know that self-recrimination was a luxury you couldn't afford when time was the resource that mattered most. What it actually meant was simpler. They'd underestimated him. They thought they knew what he was. And they were wrong. That was an advantage. He was going to use it. The next morning, he drove Victoria and said nothing about what he'd learned. He needed one more confirmation before he brought it to her, because the moment she knew about Holt, really knew, not suspected knew. With evidence in hand, her behavior would change in ways she might not be able to fully control. And right now, her performance was the thing keeping the entire plan intact. So he carried it alone. The way he'd carried hard things before, quietly, without letting it show. I was good at that too. The confirmation came 4 days later, not from Marcus, but from a name he hadn't expected: Carla Reyes. Victoria's assistant had been sharp enough to notice entirely on her own that 3 separate expenses routed through Richard Holt's departmental budget over the past 6 months were coded to a vendor category that no longer existed in the company's procurement system. Someone had reactivated an old vendor code to process payments that wouldn't be caught by the current audit system unless you specifically knew to look for the decommissioned codes. Carla had noticed because she was the one who'd recommended decommissioning those codes 18 months ago, and she remembered the specific code numbers because she had a memory for administrative details that was, in Daniel's assessment, genuinely remarkable. She'd flagged it internally, to the finance department, and it had gone nowhere. So she'd flagged it to Victoria. And Victoria had brought it to Daniel at the end of a Tuesday drive, slipping a folded piece of paper through the space between the front seats like they were passing notes in class, and saying in a completely normal voice, while her phone was still recording a memo about a board meeting. "Carla found something. I think you need to see it." He unfolded it at a red light, read it, folded it back. "Tell her she did good work," he said. "She always does." A pause. "Is this what I think it is?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. He could hear her processing it in the silence, the weight of a name she'd trusted arriving on the list of names she could no longer trust. "Richard has worked for this company for 9 years, she said. "I know. He shook my father's hand at my father's retirement party. I know. He sent flowers when my father died." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "People contain more than one thing, Ms. Sterling." She was quiet for the rest of the drive. He let her be quiet. There was nothing useful he could add to that particular grief, and he'd learned the hard way that trying to speed a person through grief before they were ready was how you made them close off the parts of themselves they needed to stay open. When they reached her building and he'd put the car in park, she didn't get out right away. She sat in the back seat and looked at her hands. "How many more people?" she asked. "I think it's contained to 3. Holt Whitfield, and one more I'm still confirming." "One more?" "Yes." She looked up and met his eyes in the mirror. "Do you know who it is?" He paused. One beat of honest hesitation, because the name he suspected would land the hardest of the 3, and he wanted to say it right. "I believe it's Mitchell Dane," he said. Victoria went very still. Mitchell Dane was her chief legal counsel. He'd been with the company longer than Holt. He'd overseen the estate settlement when her father died. He'd held her hand literally the afternoon the will was read, and the weight of everything her father had left her had come down all at once. She didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then quietly, like someone completing a sentence they'd already started somewhere inside themselves. "That's why the internal legal flag went nowhere." "Yes." He buried it. "Almost certainly." She pushed the door open, got out. And as she stood on the sidewalk in the gray afternoon, she turned back and looked at him through the open door one more time. This woman who had run a global company for 2 years on intelligence and instinct, and the kind of controlled strength that most people in a room full of power would never fully see, and she said, "I want them all." Daniel held her gaze. 3 weeks, he said. She closed the door. He drove. 8 days before the gala. Marcus Webb stopped responding to messages. 48 hours of silence. Then 72. Daniel drove Victoria's morning routes, tracked the modified schedules his contacts had run for alternate surveillance patterns, built and rebuilt the contingency approaches in the venue layout he'd had memorized for 2 weeks. And in every quiet moment between, he texted the number Marcus used and heard nothing back. On the 4th day of silence, he drove to the address he had for Marcus, an apartment in Lincoln Park that he'd never visited, had only ever known existed, because Marcus had mentioned the neighborhood once in passing, and rang the bell. No answer. He tried twice more. Waited. Left. That night, Victoria called him on the line he'd given her for private contact, which she had never done before. Just the fact that she was calling told him the ground had shifted somewhere. "Carla got a message today," she said. Her voice was steady but tight. "Anonymous. Sent to her personal email. It said that a member of the company staff had been let go for cause this morning, and that the matter was confidential and legal, had advised against discussing it internally." Daniel's jaw tightened. Did it include a name? No. But Carla checked the HR system, and someone was removed from payroll today. The record shows involuntary separation clause 7. No details. Her voice dropped slightly lower. "Daniel, Clause 7 is what they invoke when someone is terminated for what the company categorizes as a security violation." "Marcus Webb," he said. A pause. "You know him. How was helping me from inside. I should have moved him sooner." He set his jaw. Said the next thing, because it needed to be said, "I made a mistake." He didn't say it often. It cost him something real when he did. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, is he safe? I'm going to find out. And if they did this to him because he was helping you, it means they know more than I gave them credit for. He was already moving jacket on keys off the hook by the door. Stay inside your home tonight. Don't open the door for anyone except your regular residential staff. Don't discuss this on any phone or device connected to your company account. You're going out. Yes. Daniel. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not fear. Something adjacent to it but more specific. The sound of a person who has handed a piece of their safety to someone else and is now acutely aware of what that means. Be careful. He was already out the door. He found Marcus Webb alive. Not intact, not comfortable, but alive. Staying with a cousin in Evanston, having walked out of the Sterling Global building with nothing but his laptop bag, when two men from HR came to his desk that morning and told him he had 20 minutes to gather his personal items. They hadn't been hostile. They hadn't needed to be. They'd just stood there, one on each side, and watched him pack and escorted him to the elevator, and that had been it. Marcus answered the door of his cousin's apartment, looking like a man who hadn't decided yet whether to be angry or scared, and Daniel thought good. That ambivalence meant he was still thinking clearly. They moved faster than I expected, Daniel said. Marcus let him in. They moved faster than I expected too, which means they're accelerating everything. He had his laptop open on the coffee table, 3 browser windows, and a spreadsheet. Old habits. I wasn't finished when they pulled me. There's one piece I didn't get to confirm: the venue subcontractor. I found the connection to Whitfield, but I couldn't trace it to a specific person at the venue. Someone there is going to let something in the night of the gala, or let someone in, or both. I just couldn't get to the name. I'll find the name. How? Daniel looked at him. I have methods. Marcus accepted that without pressing. He'd learned by now that some things Daniel Carter was going to tell him, and some things he wasn't, and pushing on the second category was a waste of both their time. Are you safe here? Daniel asked. For now. They fired me, they didn't threaten me. I think they believe I'm scared enough to stay quiet. Are you? Marcus looked at him steadily. I'm scared enough to be careful. That's different. Daniel nodded. Good answer. Keep your head down for 6 days. When the gala breaks one way or the other, I'll reach you. And Victoria. She'll be okay. You sure about that? Daniel stood up, picked up his jacket, thought about a 9-year-old girl asleep in an apartment 6 miles from where he was standing, who thought he was really good at keeping people safe even when they didn't know he was doing it. I'm sure about that, he said. He drove back through the city with the windows down despite the cold, because the sharp air helped him think, and he had a lot of thinking left to do before tomorrow. 6 days. The gala was in 6 days. He hadn't found the name at the venue yet. Holt was active and aware. Whitfield was embedded and patient. Dane was invisible and protected by the very legal structure he'd helped build. And somewhere in the event's service infrastructure a door was going to be opened for something Daniel had not yet been able to precisely identify. But he had 6 days. He had Victoria's trust. He had Carla's eyes on the inside. He had Marcus safe and his files backed up on a server that didn't touch the Sterling Global network. And he had one thing more. He had the fact that every single person running this operation believed they knew exactly what Daniel Carter was. A driver. A quiet, unremarkable, easy-to-dismiss driver. He let them believe it. He was going to keep letting them believe it, right up until the moment it was too late to matter. 6 days felt like nothing and everything at the same time. Daniel had operated on tighter timelines before. There had been a situation in Kandahar where he'd had 4 hours to identify, locate, and extract a compromised asset through a city that had been actively hostile to every step of that plan. He'd done it. 4 hours, no sleep, no backup he could fully trust, and a margin of error so thin it didn't deserve a name. 6 days was more than 4 hours. But 6 days with a target who had 400 people as cover, an inside man controlling the security layout, a lawyer who'd spent years making his tracks disappear, and an unknown door being held open somewhere in the venue's service structure. 6 days. like that was its own kind of pressure. I was back at his desk by midnight. Up at 4:30. He drove Lily to school at 7:15, made her eat actual breakfast instead of the granola bar. She tried to substitute for it, told her he loved her at the drop-off line. She waved without turning back around, which was what 9-year-olds did when they were surrounded by friends and didn't want to seem babyish. He watched her disappear through the school's front door. Let it land for exactly the time it took to take a breath. Then he drove. The venue for the Sterling Global Annual Gala was a converted historic building on the north side that the company had rented for the past 3 years running. Daniel had been there once 2 weeks earlier when he'd driven Victoria to a walk-through meeting with the event coordinator. He'd sat in the car for 40 minutes while she was inside, and he had used those 40 minutes to walk the perimeter, not quickly, not with any purpose that would attract attention. Just a man in a suit who needed some air, moving around the outside of a building, the way a man moves when he's stretching his legs. He'd counted service entrances, timed the security camera rotation on the northeast corner, noted where the loading dock sat in relation to the main entrance and the kitchen access. He'd photographed nothing, just walked, just watched, just stored. What he was looking for now was the name. The specific person inside the venue's service structure who was holding the door. Marcus hadn't been able to get there before they'd pulled him. Daniel needed another route. He found it through the catering company. The connection between the catering company and the plate he'd photographed months earlier had been the first lead. Now he ran it forward instead of sideways. Not who owned the company that trail was layered enough to take weeks, but who was going to physically be there. Who had been assigned to the Sterling Global event specifically. He needed a staff roster for the night, and getting that without alarming anyone inside the catering operation meant being indirect about it. I was very good at indirect. By Wednesday afternoon, 4 days before the gala, he had a name. Kevin Marsh, 31 years old. Listed on the event staff roster as a floor supervisor for the catering company. Nothing in his public record that stood out. But his apartment address, when run against the map of surveillance vehicles Daniel had been building, sat 2 blocks from where the dark blue car had been parked on 3 separate occasions. That was not a coincidence. Kevin Marsh was the door. Daniel sat with that for an hour. Not because he was unsure of the identification. Because identifying the door was only the first half of the problem. The second half was figuring out what was meant to come through it. I thought about the way the operation had been designed. This was not a disorganized effort. The access codes, the financial routing, the 3-person internal network, the careful acceleration of timing to align with the gala. Someone had spent real time on this. Someone had resources and patience and a specific outcome in mind. Taking Victoria out of the company by force, which was what Marcus had called it, could mean a lot of things. It could mean public scandal, manufactured evidence, the kind of thing that made boards of directors uncomfortable enough to accept a transition of leadership. It could mean something more direct. The problem was that Daniel didn't know which it was yet, and the difference between those two things was everything in terms of how he needed to position himself the night of the event. He needed to know what was coming through that door. He called a number that had a 703 area code, which meant Northern Virginia, which was the kind of thing that didn't need further explanation to anyone who'd spent time in the work Daniel used to do. The call was answered on the second ring. He said 4 words. The person on the other end said, "Give me 48 hours. That was Thursday. Friday morning. Victoria arrived at the car looking like someone who had slept less than Daniel had, which was saying something. She had the portfolio, the tablet, the phone, everything in its right place. Every surface performing normal. But around her eyes, there was a particular kind of tightness that you only get from a night spent running scenarios instead of sleeping. He waited until they were 3 blocks from her building. No stops. Good sight lines before he said, "Are you all right?" She didn't look up from the tablet. "I've been better." "Do you need to tell me something?" A pause. "Whitfield invited himself to dinner last night. I couldn't say no without it being obvious." Daniel kept his eyes forward. "How was it?" "Exactly as awful as you'd expect." She set the tablet down, which meant she was about to say something she needed her full attention on. He spent 45 minutes talking about how much he respected my father's legacy, how important it was to protect what my father built. Her voice was controlled, but it was a controlled burn, something hot underneath doing its best not to get out. He talked about loyalty, how rare it is, how much my father valued the people who stayed. What did you say? I agreed with him, every word of it. I told him I couldn't imagine where the company would be without people like him. She picked the tablet back up. It was the most dishonest conversation I have ever had in my entire professional life. You did exactly right. I know. A pause. I hated every second of it. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Mitchell Dane called me this morning. He wants to review some of the gala's event liability documentation before Saturday. Standard stuff, he said. Don't meet him alone. I wasn't planning to. She glanced up at the mirror. I had Carla schedule it in the main conference room with 2 of my personal team present. Good. Daniel. She said his name the way she'd started saying it recently, not like an employer addressing staff, but like someone who needed the person they were talking to be paying full attention. What exactly is going to happen Saturday? He considered how much to tell her. Not because he didn't trust her, he'd moved well past that, but because there was a specific kind of psychological burden that came from knowing the full operational picture before it unfolded, and he needed her steady, not braced. Something is going to come through a service entrance at the venue, he said. I'm still confirming what. There are going to be people in that room whose job it is to create a situation, controlled confusion and incident. Something that puts you in a position of vulnerability at exactly the right moment. And the people who are supposed to protect you are going to either step aside or disappear. She absorbed that without flinching. And you, I'm going to be there. As my driver, as the only person in that building who knows the full picture. She was quiet for a beat. Then very quietly, I keep thinking about my father. Whether he would have seen this coming. She stopped herself, restarted. He trusted Whitfield completely, trusted Dane. They were his people. They were his people, Daniel said carefully. They stopped being his people at some point, for reasons that probably had very little to do with him. Greed, or fear, or the belief that a new leader meant their position was less secure. People do a lot of damage trying to protect what they think they might lose. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Is that what the military taught you? That's what watching people taught me. He paused. The military just gave me a long time to watch. She didn't push past that. She'd been doing that more lately, registering what he offered and not pressing for more than he was ready to give. He noticed it. It was a form of respect that the people with the most power in a room usually didn't know how to give. The 48 hours from the 703 number became 51. The call came back on Saturday morning, 4 days before the gala, and what it told him changed the shape of everything. It was not a scandal play. It was not manufactured documentation or a boardroom coup designed to look organic. What was coming through Kevin Marsh's door was a person. A specific person with a specific background, brought in from outside the city. Someone whose name was not connected to Sterling Global in any database that a standard corporate security sweep would catch. And that person's specialty was not theft. It was not leverage. It was not the kind of corporate pressure that left bruises you could argue in court. That person's specialty was making things look accidental. Daniel set down the phone, and he stood in his kitchen, and he took 3 slow, measured breaths. The kind of breaths you learn when you need your hands to stay steady and your mind to stay clear, when what you've just heard would make an ordinary person's hands shake. This was not a coup. This was not corporate maneuvering. What James Whitfield and Mitchell Dane and Richard Holt had built together over 8 months, with patience and money and betrayal of every trust they'd ever been given, was something designed to look like a tragedy. They weren't going to remove Victoria Sterling. They were going to erase her. He called Victoria on the private line. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. Change of plans, he said. Not on the operation on the timeline. I need you to trust me without the full picture for the next 3 days. Can you do that? A pause, shorter than he expected. Yes. When you arrive at the gala Saturday, I need you to stay within arm's reach of Carla at all times until I appear. Not security. Not Holt's team. Carla. All right. If something feels wrong before that, if your instincts fire on anything, you text me one word. Lily. He had chosen the word deliberately. If anyone saw the text, it looked like a message sent to the wrong person. Just that word. I'll know. She repeated it quietly. Lily. And then, who is Lily? My daughter. A silence that was different from the others. Softer. Like something had landed somewhere that changed the dimensions of the room they were both standing in. How old is she? Victoria asked. 9. Another pause. He didn't know what she was thinking. He didn't try to guess. She's lucky, Victoria said finally. He almost said something, stopped himself. Saturday, he said. Arm's reach of a Carla. Arm's reach of Carla, she confirmed. He hung up. Then he spent the next 3 days doing the most detailed pre-operational planning he had done since he left the Navy, because this was not a mission with backup. This was not a situation where the people around him were trained to the same level he was, and the margin between success and failure was a single moment. One grab, one movement, one decision, made in a fraction of a second, in a room full of 400 people who had no idea any of this was happening. I was allowed to get it right once. That was it. Tuesday. 3 days out. He drove to the venue on his own time, and he walked through it with the service contractor's paperwork, legitimately obtained because he'd called the venue's event management company as a representative of Sterling Global's executive transport team, confirming vehicle access routes for the evening, and he took his time. Learned the rhythm of the kitchen-to-floor service flow. Identified where the camera angles had dead zones. Found the 2 spots in the main ballroom where a person could be briefly isolated from the sight lines of the room without it looking deliberate. One of those spots was near the East Bar. The other was behind the staging area for the award presentation, where Victoria was scheduled to speak at 9:15. He noted both, sat with both, decided which one a careful patient operation would choose and which one was the backup. The East Bar was the primary. 9:15 was the backup if the primary failed. He rebuilt his entire plan around that sequencing. Wednesday. 2 days out. He met with Carla Reyes for the first and only time in person in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Sterling Global building during Carla's lunch break. He had not been sure what to expect. Victoria had told him to trust Carla completely. He'd been taking that on faith. Within 4 minutes of sitting across from her, he understood why. Carla Reyes was 53 years old, had worked for the Sterling family for 18 years, and had the specific kind of organizational intelligence that people who underestimate administrative professionals always miss until it's too late. She had already noticed, without being prompted, that 2 of Holt's usual security staff had been swapped out of the gala detail and replaced by contractors she didn't recognize from previous events. She had the names. She handed them to Daniel on a folded piece of paper across the coffee table, like someone who had done this kind of thing before, which made him think that Carla Reyes had spent 18 years noticing everything and telling very few people, and had been waiting for the right moment to actually matter. The tall one, she said, was at the Singapore subsidiary visit last year. He wasn't on any official staff list. I remembered his face because he stood near the fire exit the entire time and never had a drink. Daniel looked at the names. One of them matched a detail from the 703 call. He kept his face neutral. Saturday night, he said, you stay with Ms. Sterling. You don't leave her side for any reason, including if someone asks you to step away, including if the request comes from Holt or Whitfield or Dane or anyone on the security detail. And if it comes from you, I won't ask you to leave her side. If I appear, I'll stay with both of you. Carla folded her hands on the table. What exactly is going to happen? Something you and I are going to stop, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Victoria trusts you. I know. She doesn't trust people easily, or at all really, since her father died. She said it without judgment, just observation. So whatever you are under the driver thing, I hope it's as good as she thinks it is. Me too, he said. That was the most honest thing he'd said out loud in weeks. Thursday. 1 day out. He drove Victoria to 2 meetings and a press obligation, and in the car between the second meeting and the press event, she was so quiet he could hear her thinking. Then she said, "What was it like before this? What you used to do?" He thought about the answer for a long time. Long enough that she probably thought he wasn't going to give one. "Necessary," he said finally. She waited. "The work was necessary. The people I was with were good. And then it was over, and coming home was different than I thought it would be. And Lily's mother was gone, and there was a 9-year-old who needed someone to show up every morning and stay." He paused. "So I showed up every morning and stayed." Victoria was quiet. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He thought about Kandahar, about a dozen other places that didn't have names he was allowed to say out loud, about the specific focused clarity of knowing exactly what mattered and having the training to do something about it. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "And then Lily does something, says something, or laughs a certain way, and I don't miss it at all." She didn't respond to that, just looked out the window for a long moment. When they arrived at the press event and he opened her door, she paused before getting out. Just for a second, and she said, "For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice." She went inside. He stood beside the car for a moment in the cold and thought about the night ahead and the night after that, and everything that had been building for 3 months toward a single moment he could not afford to be late for. Then he got back in the car. Saturday. Gala night. He dropped Lily at his sister's house at 3 in the afternoon. Lily had a sleepover bag and the particular energy of a kid who knew something was happening but had decided to be cool about it. She hugged him at the door hard, the way she'd hugged him since she was small, arms all the way around, nothing held back. "Be careful," she said into his jacket. "Always." "Promise?" He held on for an extra second. "Promise," he said. He drove to the venue, parked in the service access area that his vehicle access paperwork covered. Changed in the car, not the company suit. A different one, darker, the jacket cut slightly differently, in a way that most people would never notice, but that gave him slightly more freedom of movement across the shoulders. He had no weapon. He hadn't carried one since leaving the Navy, and he wasn't going to start tonight because a weapon in a room full of 400 civilians created problems that were worse than the problems it solved. What he had was training preparation and the specific advantage of being the only person in that building who knew the complete shape of what was about to happen. The guests began arriving at 6. He positioned himself at the edge of the room, not conspicuously, not in the way that security staff position themselves when they want to be seen, but in the way that a driver who has accompanied a CEO to an event positions himself available, unremarkable, easy to look past. Holt's new contractor staff were already in position. He clocked them in under 3 minutes. The tall one Carla had identified was near the East Bar, which confirmed that as the primary location. A second man was near the service corridor that connected to the loading dock and Kevin Marsh's entry point. The third was stationed at the base of the staging area steps. All 3 in position by 6:30. 90 minutes before Victoria was scheduled to speak. She arrived at 6:45 with Carla 2 steps behind her exactly as planned. She was in a dark blue dress that was neither overdressed nor underdressed for the room, which was a choice in itself, not trying to command attention, trying to belong in the room at the right proportion. She worked the early guests with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had been doing this since before she ran the company. Shaking hands and laughing at the right moments and moving through the crowd with the particular authority of a person who doesn't need the room to quiet down to know she's the most important one in it. She didn't look for Daniel. She knew he was there. At 7:20, Whitfield arrived. At 7:40, Dane. At 8:05, Holt moved through the room in a wide loop that covered every entry point except the service corridor, which told Daniel that Holt was not watching that corridor because he already knew it was handled. At 8:17, Daniel's phone vibrated with a text from a number he'd set up for venue monitoring. One word. Moving. Kevin Marsh had opened the door. Daniel began to move. Not fast. Not in a way that drew the eye. The way water moves when you tip a glass, inevitable, controlled quiet about it until it isn't. He angled toward the east bar, keeping the staging area in his peripheral, tracking Holt's position and the tall contractor's position. Simultaneously, the way you learn to track multiple targets when your life has required it. Victoria was 30 feet away, still working the room, Carla a step behind. Whitfield had drifted toward them in the last 10 minutes, closing distance casually. Dane was approaching from the other direction. Not obviously, not quickly. The way two people close in on a position when they've rehearsed it. The person who had come through the door. Daniel still didn't have eyes on them. Yet they were in the service corridor behind the east bar, was moving into position. 20 feet. Whitfield said something to Victoria, and she laughed and turned slightly, putting her back toward the bar, which was what they needed, what they had engineered through the whole evening. The angle, the movement, the carefully casual choreography of people who had planned this for 8 months. 15 feet. The tall contractor shifted away from the bar toward the edge of the room, creating a gap. Not specific. The gap that allowed someone moving from the service corridor to reach a particular point in the room without crossing anyone's sight line. Daniel saw the catering uniform. He saw the hand position, the slight angled grip that didn't match the body language of someone carrying a tray. 10 feet. He moved. He covered the distance in 4 seconds, not running, not the kind of movement that makes people turn and look, the specific compressed urgency of someone who knows exactly where they need to be and is simply getting there. And he arrived at Victoria Sterling's shoulder. At the precise moment, the man in the catering uniform came within arm's reach. Daniel grabbed the man's wrist. Hard. 1 second before the needle touched Victoria Sterling's neck. Nobody saw it happen. The music was loud. The champagne was flowing. 400 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits, laughing, clinking glasses, celebrating the most powerful woman in the room. Nobody was watching the driver. The man in the catering uniform froze. His eyes went wide. Daniel leaned in close, quiet, the kind of close that looks from across the room like two people sharing a conversation, and he said 5 words directly into the man's ear. 5 very specific words. The kind of words that only mean something if you know the name and the number and the precise detail that Daniel's contact had given him. 51 hours earlier, the kind of words that tell a person clearly and unmistakably that the person saying them knows exactly who sent you, what you were paid, and where the money came from, and that information is already in the hands of people who are not in this room. The color drained from the man's face. He did not resist. He did not run. He stood completely still with Daniel's hand locked around his wrist, and he made a calculation. The fast, brutal calculation of a person who understands that the situation they walked into is not the situation they were told they were walking into, and he chose the only option that didn't make everything worse. He let go of what was in his hand. Daniel caught it before it hit the floor. Victoria had gone still beside him. She hadn't seen exactly what happened. It was too fast, too close, too quiet. But she felt the shift in the air around her, the way you feel when the temperature drops before a storm. And she did something that Daniel later thought reflected exactly the kind of instincts that had kept her running a global company for 2 years under impossible pressure. She kept her face completely neutral, kept holding her champagne glass, turned to the nearest and said something about the venue's renovation that made the guest laugh. Carla stepped in from the other side smoothly, naturally, the way someone who has spent 18 years protecting a family learns to close ranks without anyone knowing it. The man in the catering uniform was escorted to the service corridor by Daniel in the next 45 seconds. Not roughly, not in a way that drew attention. Just 2 people moving with purpose. In the service corridor, 2 men were waiting. Men Daniel had called on Wednesday from the 703 number who were not connected to Sterling Global or to Holt or to any of the structures that had been corrupted. They had credentials and a legal basis, and the collected documentation that Marcus had started building, and Daniel had finished, and they handled the rest quietly. Daniel turned and walked back into the ballroom. Holt saw him from across the room. Their eyes met. And in that single locked moment of recognition, the moment when Richard Holt understood what had just happened and what it meant, Daniel watched a man's careful construction of himself come apart behind his eyes. Holt reached for his earpiece. "Don't," Daniel said. He was close enough now. "It's over." The documentation is already filed. The accounts are already frozen. And the 2 people you brought in tonight are being held in the loading bay by federal agents." He paused, kept his voice completely steady. "You can walk out of here under your own power, or you can make this louder than it needs to be. Your choice. You have about 10 seconds. Holt's hand dropped from the earpiece. He made the choice. Across the room, Victoria was being told something quietly by Carla, just a few words, a hand on her arm, and Victoria set down her champagne glass with the specific, deliberate steadiness of a woman who has just understood the full shape of the night and is deciding what to do with it. She looked for Daniel. He was already there. "It's done," he said quietly. She searched his face, looking for the part that wasn't true, not finding it. "All of them. Holt is handling the walk. Federal authority has the others. Whitfield and Dane are going to be met at the door when they try to leave." He said it simply, like reporting a status. "It's done, Ms. Sterling." She breathed out. One slow, controlled exhale. The kind that has weeks of held tension in it. The room around them was still celebrating. 400 people with champagne and conversation, completely unaware that anything had happened. The music was still playing. The caterers were still circling with appetizers. Everything exactly as it had been 5 minutes ago, except that the entire architecture of what had been built to destroy this woman had collapsed in a ballroom where nobody noticed a thing. Victoria looked at the room. Then she looked at Daniel. "You said 5 words to him," she said. "The man with the—" She stopped herself. "What were they?" He looked at her. "I told him we had the phone records, the account number, the name of the man who hired him, and that a federal warrant had been executed 40 minutes ago." He paused. "That's more than 5 words." She almost laughed. "You counted wrong." I simplified for the delivery. This time she did laugh. Not loud. Just a short, real, exhausted, relieved sound that was one of the most human things he had heard from her in 4 months of watching her perform perfection. And then the evening continued. Because it had to. Because 400 people were in that room, and Victoria Sterling was still the CEO of this company, and the best thing she could do for all of it was stand up straight and be exactly who she was for the rest of the night. She did. Daniel stood at the edge of the room and watched her do it, and felt something settle in his chest that hadn't been settled in a long time. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like it worked. Worked. They're safe. You can breathe now. At 9:15 right on schedule. Victoria Sterling walked to the staging area and delivered a speech about her father's legacy and the future of the company she'd fought to protect. And the room gave her a standing ovation, and she thanked them with the kind of grace that comes from someone who means every single word. Daniel watched from where he stood. And for the first time in 3 months, he was not watching for danger. He was just watching. The night after the gala, Daniel slept 4 hours. Not because he couldn't sleep more. Because his body had been running on operational tempo for 3 months, and it didn't know how to downshift in a single night. He lay in the dark and listened to the apartment settle around him and ran through every moment of the previous evening, the way he always ran through completed operations, not looking for what had gone wrong, but confirming what had gone right, mapping the margins, noting where the variance between plan and execution had been widest and narrowest. The margin at the East Bar had been narrower than he would have liked. He'd made it. But a second and a half slower, and the story ended differently. He filed that. Let it sit. Got up at 4:30, made coffee, and sat at his desk in the quiet dark, and waited for the world to start moving again. It started moving at 6:12 when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. "Mr. Carter." A woman's voice. Professional measured the specific cadence of someone who worked in federal law enforcement and had learned to front-load authority in the first 2 words of any conversation. "My name is Special Agent Patricia Okafor. I'd like to speak with you this morning about the events at the Sterling Global Gala." "I expected this call," he said. "I thought you might." A pause. "Are you available at 9? "I'll make myself available." He showered, changed, called his sister to check on Lily, who was, according to his sister, absolutely fine, and had eaten an enormous breakfast and was currently in the backyard with a stick pretending to be either an explorer or a pirate. It was hard to tell which. Special Agent Okafor was 40-something. Sharp-eyed, and had the kind of organized patience that federal investigators develop over years of talking to people who think they're smarter than the process. She had a partner named Reyes, different Reyes, not Carla, who took notes and said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes. Daniel told her what she needed to know. Not everything. There were channels and contacts and methods he'd used that existed in a space that required a different kind of conversation with a different kind of federal authority. But the operational structure of what Whitfield and Holt and Dane had built. The documentation. Marcus had pulled the financial routing. Carla had found the identity and role of Kevin Marsh and the background on the person who had come through the service entrance. Okafor listened without interrupting. Took her own notes in addition to her partner's. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You built this case over 3 months," she said. "Alone." "With help." Marcus Webb, Carla Reyes. "Yes." "And you didn't bring this to federal law enforcement because the internal security director was active in the operation, and I had no way to verify the integrity of any external referral chain he might have had access to." He said it simply. "I needed the evidence complete before I brought it to anyone who could act on it." Okafor studied him for a moment. "You have a background." It wasn't a question. "I drove a car," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the kind that appears when a person is acknowledging something they're not going to push on. "We're going to need your full documentation," she said. "Everything you collected. Chain of custody for all of it. My attorney will be in contact by end of day." "You have an attorney?" "I had one on retainer before I took this job." Another moment of silence. The ghost of the smile again. "Mr. Carter," she said, "whoever you used to be, I think you were very good at it." He stood up. "Thank you for your time, Agent Okafor." He was out of the building by 10:15. The news broke at 2 in the afternoon. Not the full picture. The full picture would take weeks to emerge through the legal proceedings that were already in motion, but enough. Sterling Global's chief legal counsel and a senior board advisor had been detained in connection with what was being described initially as a corporate security incident. Richard Holt had submitted his resignation that morning, which was the way people who cooperated early signaled their cooperation without saying it out loud. Daniel heard about it from his sister, who texted him a link to the news story with about 12 question mark emojis and one that he chose to interpret as concern for his well-being. How was in his car outside an ordinary grocery store because he'd remembered that Lily was coming home tomorrow and he needed to stock the refrigerator with something that wasn't condiments and leftover rice. He sat in the parking lot and read the article on his phone and thought about the distance between what the article described and what had actually happened. The gap between the story that the public would know and the story that he and Carla and Marcus and Victoria would carry, the version with all the texture and weight and quiet terror of the real thing. He bought groceries. Drove home. Made chicken for dinner because Lily liked the chicken thing and it gave him something to do with his hands. Victoria called at 7:48. Not the private line. His personal number, which she had never used before. He'd given it to her early on for emergencies, and she'd held it for 4 months without touching it, and the fact that she was using it now, the day after, meant something he couldn't quite name yet, but could feel at the edges. "Are you home?" she asked. "Yes." "Is Lily home?" "Tomorrow. She's at my sister's." "Okay." A pause. "I've been in meetings since 7 this morning. Legal board communications, federal liaisons. Everyone needs a piece of this, and everyone needs it immediately." She sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with lost sleep. The exhausted, echoing kind of tired that comes from being needed by everyone for hours without a single moment of being allowed to just be a person. "I kept thinking throughout all of it. I kept thinking about the fact that I need to say something to you. And I didn't know how to do that in a room full of attorneys. You don't have to say anything." "I know I don't have to." She paused. "I want to." He waited. "You spent 3 months," she said. You sacrificed, I don't even know the full shape of what you sacrificed, what you put on the line, what it cost you in terms of the life you're trying to build with your daughter, and you did it without asking for anything, without telling me, without any guarantee that I was going to believe you or help you or do anything except fire you the way Holt wanted to. She stopped, restarted. I called you a driver. Everyone in that building called you a driver, and you let them. You just let them. It was useful. Daniel. She said it firmly, not harsh, just the specific firmness of someone who needs the person they're talking to stop deflecting for 30 consecutive seconds. Let me say this. He was quiet. Thank you, she said. For all of it. For the 3 months. For Friday night in the stairwell. For giving me 20 minutes that turned into 34. For Carla and for Marcus. And for the fact that when it mattered most, you were exactly where you needed to be. Her voice steadied further. My father used to say that the most important thing in any room was not the person with the biggest title. It was the person with the clearest eyes. I think he would have known what you were the moment he met you. Daniel sat with that for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man, he said. He was. A pause. I'm hosting a small meeting tomorrow afternoon. Board members. I trust the ones who are clean, and I've had about 14 hours to verify that list very carefully. I'd like you to attend. He blinked. Attend. Not as my driver, as the person who built the case that saved this company. Her voice was matter-of-fact in the way it got when she'd made a decision and wasn't looking for debate. There are people in that room who need to understand what happened and who made it possible. I'm not going to let you be invisible for that conversation. He didn't answer right away. Not because he was reluctant, because being seen, actually seen, not as a threat or an oddity or someone to be dismissed or managed, was something he'd spent enough years doing without that it required a moment to adjust to. 2 o'clock, she said. If you're willing. I'll be there, he said. She said good night. He sat in his quiet kitchen with the phone in his hand and thought about his father who had died when Daniel was 23, and who had been a man with no title and no power and no corner office, who had worked his whole life with his hands and had never once been in a room that cared about his opinion, who had raised Daniel to believe that what you were willing to do when no one was watching was the only real measure of who you were. I thought his father would have appreciated this day. Then he thought about Lily. And he called his sister and talked to Lily for 20 minutes about the Pirate Explorer situation and the science project, and whether or not the chicken thing for dinner tomorrow was a real promise or a maybe promise, and she made him confirm it was real 3 times before she was satisfied. And when she said goodnight, she said it with the complete, uncomplicated trust of a 9-year-old who had never once doubted that her father would be there in the morning. He carried that to bed. It was better than anything else he could have carried. The board meeting the next afternoon was not what he expected, and Daniel was rarely surprised by rooms. There were 8 people seated when he arrived. Victoria at the head of the table, Carla to her left, a board attorney he didn't recognize at the far end, and 5 board members whose names he knew from 4 months of background reading, but whose faces he was meeting for the first time. They ranged from a 70-year-old named Harold Gaines, who had known Victoria's father since the company's founding, and looked like he was running on sheer institutional memory and excellent tailoring, to a 40-something woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who ran the company's international investment division and had the specific focused alertness of someone who had already read everything available on this situation and had 17 questions. Victoria did not introduce Daniel as her driver. She introduced him by name and said, "Daniel Carter is the reason everyone in this room still has a company to sit in." Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. Daniel sat. And for the next 2 hours, he laid out exactly what had been built, and how and by whom, with the clean, structured precision of someone who had spent years making complicated situations comprehensible to people who needed to make fast decisions. He answered 14 questions from Dr. Nair, 3 from Harold Gaines, who asked them slowly and listened to the answers with the focused attention of a man who understood that slow questions often get the truest answers, and 2 from the board attorney, who was clearly recalibrating the legal exposure picture in real time. At the end, Harold Gaines looked at Daniel across the table for a long moment. "Young man," he said, which Daniel noted was relative, given their age gap was about 30 years. I've been in business for 5 decades. I've sat across from a lot of people who told me they'd protected something important. Most of them were protecting themselves. He paused. You protected something that wasn't yours. That's different. That matters. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. So he said, "Thank you, sir." Gaines nodded once, like something had been decided. After the meeting, Victoria walked him to the elevator herself. The building around them was still operating on its normal rhythms. Phones, ringing, meetings happening. The enormous ordinary machinery of a company that employed 11,000 people running without any awareness of how close it had come to a very different kind of day. Gaines wants to offer you a formal position, Victoria said. Not a driver's position. She said it in the careful, neutral way of someone presenting information that she has feelings about and is working to not project. What kind of position? Corporate security, senior level, reporting directly to me. We need to rebuild that department from the ground up, and he believes, and I agree, that you should be the one who does it. I was quiet for a moment. The elevator arrived. Neither of them moved toward it. I need to think about it, he said. I know. She wasn't pushing. There's no timeline pressure. Take whatever time you need. A pause. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I don't want you to make it based on what you think I need. I want you to make it based on what you actually want. He looked at her. When's the last time someone said that to you? She thought about it, honestly. A while. Then maybe we both need to work on that. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Warmer than the ones she used in meetings. The kind that reaches a person's eyes when they're not thinking about whether they should be smiling. Maybe so, she said. The elevator closed without either of them having gotten in. He drove home. Picked up Lily from his sister's house. She fell asleep in the car on the way back, which she always did, had been doing since she was 4 years old. No matter how short the drive, some people just sleep easily in moving vehicles, and Lily was one of them. He carried her inside. Put her to bed. Stood in the doorway of her room for a moment in the dark, the way he always did, listening to her breathe the deep, untroubled sleep of someone who believed completely in their own safety. He thought about the silver sedan, the dark blue car, the folder on Marcus Webb's coffee table, the stairwell on Friday evening, the man in the catering uniform, and the sound of 5 words landing in someone's ear, like stones dropped in still water. He thought about Harold Gaines saying you protected something that wasn't yours. He thought yes and no. Because this was the thing that people who sat in boardrooms and evaluated risk through spreadsheets never quite understood. You didn't protect people because it was your job, or because the title said so, or because someone had drawn you a line of authority and pointed you in the right direction. You protected people because some part of you had decided quietly without ceremony. At some point, you couldn't always identify that their safety was something you were responsible for. Not legally, not professionally, just personally. In the way that certain things become yours, not because you chose them, but because you couldn't put them down. He thought about Victoria Sterling, who had run a company through grief and challenge and betrayal and had never stopped showing up. Who had trusted him with 20 minutes in a stairwell and turned it into something neither of them could have managed alone. He thought he owed her an honest answer. He called Marcus Webb the next morning. Marcus answered on the second ring, which was the fastest he'd responded to anything in the last 2 weeks, which probably said something about what his days looked like without the Sterling Global job to fill them. How are you? Daniel asked. Unemployed, Marcus said. But in a, I don't know. In a way that feels different than I expected. Like maybe being unemployed from that specific place at this specific time is actually fine. The federal attorneys are going to want your documentation and your testimony. I know, they already reached out. A pause. The whole thing is in the news. It's strange to read about something and know where the bodies are buried, so to speak. You did good work, Marcus. Silence. The kind that comes from someone who hasn't heard that sentence applied to them in a while and isn't sure exactly what to do with it. You too, Marcus said. And then, what happens now for you, I mean? I'm still deciding. Victoria offered you something. It wasn't a question. Daniel absorbed the fact that Marcus had already heard this and filed it away for later consideration. She did. Are you going to take it? I said I'd think about it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, and I know my worth is currently at a pretty specific market low employment-wise, I think you should. Not for her. Not for the company. But because you spent 3 months being underestimated by every person in that building, except me and Carla. And I think part of what makes this hard is that you've gotten so good at being invisible that you've started to believe that's the only way to operate. A pause. Some things are worth doing at full volume, Daniel. Daniel let that sit for a long moment. How did you end up in corporate finance analytics? He asked. I'm good with numbers, and I was afraid of everything else. A beat. Is that an answer? It's an honest one. Yeah, well, honest is about all I've got right now. He paused again. Call me when you decide either way. I'd like to know. I will. He hung up, made coffee, sat at the desk that had been the center of 3 months of late-night work and looked at the surface of it. The notepad, the pen, the small framed photo of Lily at 6 years old in her Halloween costume that she'd specifically requested he keep on his desk because she wanted to feel like she was watching over him while he worked, and he thought about what Marcus had said. Some things are worth doing at full volume. The twist when it came from a direction Daniel hadn't anticipated, which was, he reflected later, the nature of twists. It came on Thursday, 5 days after the gala, in the form of a phone call from Okafor that he answered while standing in his kitchen making Lily's after-school snack. I wanted to give you some information before it became public, Okafor said. Her voice had a careful quality that he recognized as the sound of a federal agent navigating something delicate. We've completed the initial review of the financial structure behind the operation. The routing we traced through Whitfield's holding company goes further back than we initially assessed. How far back? Daniel asked. 7 years. He set down the knife he'd been holding. 7 years. Whitfield had been at Sterling Global for 14. Victoria's father had run the company for the first 12 of those. Which meant this operation, or something like it, the architecture of it, the financial network that fed it had begun, not as a play against Victoria, but as a play that had started under her father. Are you telling me, Daniel said slowly, that Edward Sterling was aware of what Whitfield was building? I'm telling you that the financial structure predates Victoria Sterling's leadership by several years, and that we're currently working to determine the nature of the relationship between the original structure and Edward Sterling's personal financial accounts. A pause. I'm not making a determination. I'm telling you that the picture is more complicated than anyone understood. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Okafor said, Mr. Carter. I hear you, he said. Does she know? Not yet. We'll be contacting her legal team today. Thank you for calling me first. I thought you'd want the chance to be available to her when she receives the information. I thought about a woman who had carried her father's legacy like something sacred, who had spoken about her father at the gala with the kind of love that's only possible when grief and admiration have fused into a single feeling, who had said in a stairwell 3 weeks ago, I keep thinking about my father, whether he would have seen this coming. I'll be available, he said. He texted Victoria immediately. Not with any information. Just I know you're about to receive a call from federal counsel. I'm here when you need to talk. She responded in 4 minutes. One word. Thank you. The call from Okafor reached Victoria at 2:15. Daniel knew because Victoria texted him at 2:16. Can you come? Not a question. The kind of message that doesn't have a question mark because the person sending it is holding too many things at once to manage punctuation. I was already in his car. He found her in her office, not the main one, the smaller one behind it that she used when she needed to think and didn't want to be visible from the glass walls of the executive floor. Carla was outside the door, which meant Carla had already been told enough to know that Victoria needed a closed door and someone keeping the world at bay. Carla looked at Daniel when he arrived. Just looked. He could see in her face that she'd already heard some version of it and had been sitting with the weight of it for the past hour. She's okay, Carla said. She's processing. How long has she been alone? 20 minutes. He knocked once, heard come in. She was standing by the window. He could tell by the quality of the light in the room, the way it shifted when he opened the door. He crossed the office and stood near her without filling the silence immediately, because some silences need to exist before they can be replaced by anything useful. They're saying it started before me, she said. Whatever Whitfield was building, the financial structure, the network, it started when my father was running the company. I know. Okafor called me first. She turned to look at him. You knew before I did. By about 45 minutes. I wanted to be here when you found out. She absorbed that, turned back toward the window. Do you think my father knew? Daniel thought carefully. About Edward Sterling, who he had never met, whose character he knew only through documents and through the things the people who loved him said about him, who had built a company and a legacy and a daughter who had spent 2 years protecting both. I think, he said slowly, that the investigation will tell you what the evidence shows, and I think you should wait for that before you decide what it means. That's a very careful answer. It's an honest one. I don't know your father. You do. She was quiet. What if... She stopped, started again. What if he knew something was wrong and didn't act on it? What if he saw something and looked away, because looking at it meant losing people he'd trusted for 20 years? Then he was human, Daniel said. And he was also the man who built something worth protecting, and who raised someone with the character to protect it when it mattered. Both of those things can be true. She didn't respond right away. He could feel her working through it, not the logic that would come later in the quiet hours and the long weeks of the investigation, but the immediate human daughter's weight of finding out that the story you thought you knew about someone you loved was more complicated than you'd been allowed to see. My father used to tell me, she said finally, that the two most important things in any person were what they did when they were scared and what they did when they were sure. A pause. I used to think I understood what he meant. And now I think I'm going to have to figure out which category he was in. They stood in that silence for another minute. Then she turned from the window and looked at him directly. The way she'd started looking at him fully, without the professional surface, her eyes usually carried in a room full of people with agendas. I'm glad you came, she said. You asked me to. You were already in your car before I texted. He didn't deny it. She almost smiled. How did you know? Okafor told me the call was going to your legal team at 2 o'clock. You always answer your phone on the first ring when it's your attorneys. I estimated you'd hear within 15 minutes. It takes me 20 minutes to drive here. She shook her head slowly, not in frustration, in something closer to wonder. You ran the timing. Old habit. Daniel. She said his name the way it had come to land recently, as a whole sentence complete in itself, carrying more than the syllables required. I want to tell you something, and I need you to not deflect it, or minimize it, or turn it into something practical. He looked at her. All right, I've been running this company for 2 years. I've had advisors and attorneys and board members and security teams. I've had people whose entire job was to tell me what I needed to know. She paused. None of them saw this. None of them were watching. None of them stayed up at their own desk on their own time, building something alone because they decided it was necessary. Her voice was steady and direct. You did. And you didn't do it because it was your job. You did it because that's who you are. And I think... She stopped. Collected something. I think I misjudged what I was looking at for the first 4 months. I looked at you and I saw a driver. And you were never a driver. I was a pretty good driver, actually. She did laugh at that. A real one. The exhausted, full, genuinely surprised kind. Yes, she said. You were. And then she was quiet again. And something in the quiet was different from all the other quiets in all the cars and stairwells and corridors of the last 4 months. It was lighter. It had room in it. The position Gaines mentioned, she said. I meant what I said. No pressure. But I want you to know it's not gratitude or obligation. It's because I've spent the last 2 weeks watching you operate, and I think you're exactly what this company needs. And more than that, I think it might be exactly what you need too. He looked at her. Why? Because you're good at being invisible. But I don't think you want to be anymore. He was quiet for a long moment. I have a daughter, he said. Whatever I do, she's the first line of the equation. I know that. She said it simply, without condition. That's part of why I trust your judgment. He thought about Lily asleep in a moving car, about the Halloween photo on his desk, about the science project they'd built from a cardboard box and a conversation about the water cycle, about a 9-year-old who thought her father was really good at keeping people safe even when they didn't know it. Give me the weekend, he said. Take the weekend. He left her office and walked past Carla, who looked at him with the calm, reading-the-room intelligence of a woman who understood exactly what had happened in that office and needed no summary, and took the elevator down and got in his car. He drove home the long way. Not because he needed the extra time, but because the city at dusk does something particular to the thinking mind, puts it at just the right distance from everything close enough to feel it far enough to see it whole. He thought about what he was. Not what he'd been, not what they'd called him, what he actually was. He thought about Harold Gaines, you protected something that wasn't yours. He thought about Marcus, some things are worth doing at full volume. I thought about Victoria. I don't think you want to be invisible anymore. He thought about Lily. You're really good at keeping people safe, Dad, even when they don't know you're doing it. He pulled into his parking space, sat for a moment. Then he went upstairs. He made the chicken thing because he'd promised. He helped with the rest of the science project, which Lily informed him had been given a slight modification by Mrs. Patterson that required them to redo the precipitation section entirely, which she delivered with the specific calm of someone who had already accepted it and needed him to accept it too. He accepted it. They ate dinner. She talked about Priya again, and about a book she'd started, and about something funny her cousin had said at his sister's house. He listened to all of it, every word. After dinner, she sat across from him at the kitchen table with her chin in her hand, looking at him with the particular expression she wore when she'd been thinking about something all day and had decided it was time. Dad, she said. Yeah. Are you going to do something different now for work? He looked at his daughter. Why are you asking? Because you look different than you did yesterday, like something is figured out. He thought about everything that had been figured out, and everything that hadn't, and everything that was still in the process of becoming clear. Maybe, he said. Is it safer? He thought about an offer on a table, about a company that employed 11,000 people, about a woman who needed someone around her with clear eyes and no agenda except the truth. It might actually be safer than driving, he said, and harder in different ways. Lily nodded, satisfied. She trusted his assessment of these things completely, which was both the most comforting and the most weightful thing he carried every day. Okay, she said. Can I have dessert? Did you finish the precipitation section? She made a face. Almost. Finish the precipitation section. She went back to her notebook. He cleaned up the kitchen. And in the ordinary Tuesday evening quiet of the apartment, with the sound of Lily's pencil scratching across paper in the other room and the city doing its endless city things outside the window, Daniel Carter made a decision. He didn't announce it, didn't call anyone, just made it. The way he made most of the important decisions in his life, quietly, without ceremony, in the spaces between everything else. Some things are worth doing at full volume. He thought yes. He thought all right then. And he went to help Lily with the precipitation section, because that was also worth doing, and worth doing right. And the two things had never once been in conflict with each other. That was the part people always missed about him. He wasn't divided. He never had been. He was exactly one thing, a man who showed up completely for everyone who needed him every single time. And that, it turned out, was enough. That was more than enough. He called Victoria on Monday morning at 8:15. She answered on the first ring, which she always did when it was a call that mattered, and he knew before he said a word that she'd been waiting for this one. Specifically, the way a person waits when they've said everything they can say, and now the only thing left is the other person's answer. I'll take the position, he said. A pause. Short. The kind that happens when someone has been holding their breath without knowing it and is now quietly letting it go. Good, she said. And then because she was Victoria Sterling, and she did not perform emotion, she wasn't actually feeling, I'm glad, Daniel. There are conditions. I expected conditions. Lily comes first, always. If she needs me, I go. No conversation, no argument, no matter what's happening. Agreed. I build the department my way. Full authority over hiring structure and protocol. No committee approval on operational decisions. Agreed. And I won't carry a title that doesn't mean what it says. If I'm head of security, I'm head of security. Not in name, in function. That's exactly what I want, she said. Anything else? I thought for a moment. Yes, Marcus Webb gets offered a position. Not charity, I've seen his work. He's good, and you need someone who can run internal compliance with actual integrity. He's that person. A pause. He could hear her thinking. Not hesitating, just processing the way she processed everything fast and clean. Done, she said. I'll have HR reach out today. One more thing. Go ahead. Carla gets a raise. Whatever she's making now, it's not enough. She found the vendor code anomaly that cracked the financial routing open. She did it alone without being asked, and she brought it to you instead of burying it. That kind of loyalty is worth more than her current salary reflects. He could hear something shift in Victoria's voice, something warmer. I already took care of that on Friday. He nodded to himself. All right then, she echoed. A beat of something comfortable between them, the specific ease that develops between two people who have been through something real together and no longer need to manage each other. Can you start Wednesday? Tuesday, he said. She almost laughed. Tuesday. He hung up. Sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet, made a second cup of coffee, and then pulled out his phone and called Marcus. Marcus answered, sounding like a man who had spent the last 6 days refreshing his email and was trying to act like he hadn't. HR from Sterling Global is going to reach out today, Daniel said without preamble. Take the call. Silence. Then, seriously. Compliance and internal integrity oversight. It's a new position. You'd be reporting to me and to Victoria directly. Another silence. Longer. The kind where a person is deciding whether to be professionally measured or just honestly themselves. Marcus chose honestly himself. Daniel, yes, absolutely yes. Good. There's a lot of work to do. I know. I actually have a draft framework for the internal audit restructuring. I've been working on it because I had nothing else to do, and it kept my brain from anyway. Yes, I'm ready. I know you are, Daniel said. That's why I asked. He could hear Marcus exhale. Thank you. Don't thank me, just do the work. Yes, sir, Marcus said. And then immediately, with the slight embarrassment of someone who hadn't meant to say that, sorry that just, it's fine, Daniel said, and meant it. Tuesday arrived with the specific freshness of a day that knows it's the beginning of something. Daniel was up at 5. He made breakfast for Lily, actual breakfast eggs and toast, not the granola bar. She was already angling toward before she was fully awake and drove her to school himself. At the drop-off line, she turned back this time, which she didn't always do, and waved with the particular energy of a kid who had registered that something was different today and approved of it without needing to articulate why. He watched her go through the front doors and felt the thing he always felt, the total, irreducible love of a parent, which is the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing a person ever carries. Then he drove to Sterling Global. He did not park in the service structure. He parked in the main lot, walked through the front entrance, took the elevator to the executive floor. And when the receptionist at the front desk, a young woman named Amber, who had looked through him every morning for 4 months, started to direct him toward the visitor's sign-in, he said quietly, "My name is Daniel Carter. I'm the new head of corporate security. I believe my credentials were issued yesterday." Amber blinked, checked her screen, looked up at him with the expression of someone reconfiguring a familiar image into a completely different shape. "Yes, Mr. Carter, of course. I'm sorry I didn't." "No need," he said. "Have a good morning, Amber." He walked past the desk toward the executive suite. And he did not look back, not because he was making a point, but because he was already thinking about what came next. That was the difference between someone performing authority and someone who simply had it. One of them needed the room to notice. The other was already working. The first week was dense. Not difficult dense. The kind of density that comes from taking apart a structure that has been corrupted at multiple levels and rebuilding it from the floor up, which requires the simultaneous management of existing personnel who don't know whether they still have jobs, external investigators who need access to records that are also active evidence, a board that is processing its own institutional shock, and a CEO who is running the company's public face through a media cycle that does not stop because the internal architecture is under reconstruction. Daniel moved through all of it with the same quality he brought to every situation that required more than one thing at once: complete attention. Not divided attention. Complete. The part of him that needed to do each thing was fully present for that thing, and then it was done, and the next thing had his full presence. He had learned this in places that didn't allow for the luxury of half measures, and he had never unlearned it. By Friday of the first week, he had replaced 4 of Holt's contracted security staff with people he'd vetted personally, had installed a new access protocol that eliminated the administrator code backdoor that Holt had exploited, had begun a full audit of every vendor contract active in the building and flagged 11 for immediate review, and had sat in 3 separate interviews with federal investigators, each time laying out documentation with the precise clarity of someone who has always known that the cleaner you build your case, the faster justice moves. Okafor told him on Friday afternoon at the end of the 3rd interview that he was the most organized non-attorney witness she had ever worked with. He told her he'd had good teachers. She looked at him with the same measured expression she'd worn in their first meeting. Whoever they were, she said, they knew what they were doing. He agreed and said nothing further, which she also seemed to expect. The federal case against Whitfield, Dane, and Holt moved with a speed that surprised most people, but didn't surprise Daniel, because he understood that when you walk into a federal proceeding with 3 months of documented evidence, clean chain of custody, cooperative witnesses, and financial records that have already been frozen, the legal machinery has very little reason to slow down. The preliminary hearings were scheduled for the following month. All 3 had retained counsel. None of them had spoken publicly. Kevin Marsh, the man who had opened the service entrance door, cooperated fully. His cooperation was what gave the federal case its cleanest line to the person outside the city who had been brought in for the final act, a man named Gerald Price, 54 years old, with a background that moved through private security and corporate intelligence, and a series of consulting arrangements that were, when you looked at them carefully, a paper architecture built to make him very hard to trace. He was traced. It took Okafor's team 11 days. He was in federal custody by the end of the 2nd week. The day Price's arrest was reported, Daniel was in a meeting with 3 of his new security hires going over the revised access protocols. His phone lit up with the news alert. He glanced at it, set it face down, finished the meeting. Afterward, one of the new hires, a former FBI analyst named Torres, who had 15 years on Daniel in the bureaucratic world, if not in the field, caught him in the corridor. "Price," Torres said. "You knew that was coming." "Since last week," Daniel said. "How do you stay that calm about it?" Daniel looked at him, thought about the question honestly. "Because Price was the last piece," he said. "Everything before him was preparation. Everything after him is resolution. The middle is where the work happens. The ends take care of themselves if you did the middle right." Torres thought about that, nodded slowly. "And did you?" "We'll find out in court," Daniel said. "But yes, I think so." He went back to work. The twist Daniel didn't see coming arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into his new role, in the form of a certified envelope that his assistant. He had an assistant now, which was still something his brain occasionally rejected as implausible, placed on his desk at 10:15 in the morning. The envelope was from the office of a law firm in Washington, D.C. The letter inside was 4 pages and had language that was designed to be navigated, not read, which was always the signal to stop navigating and read it very carefully instead. He read it twice, stood up, walked down the hall to Victoria's office. She looked up from her desk when he came in, registered his expression, said, "Shut the door." He shut it, sat down across from her, set the letter on the desk between them. "This is from Whitfield's attorneys," he said. "They're asserting that certain financial documents related to the early operational structure. The accounts dating back 7 years were originated not by Whitfield, but under direction from your father's office. Specifically, they're claiming that Edward Sterling created the financial architecture that Whitfield later used, and that Whitfield was acting under standing instructions that predated his own involvement." Victoria picked up the letter. "Read it. Set it down." Her face was completely composed, which meant everything underneath it was working very hard. "They're trying to shift culpability," she said. "They're trying to complicate the narrative enough that the case becomes about a dead man's decisions instead of living people's choices. Can they make that work? Legally, Okafor's team will respond. The financial records are what they are." He paused. "But it will surface publicly. It will be in the coverage. And for a period of time, your father's name is going to be attached to a version of this story that isn't clean." She was quiet for a long moment. He watched her sit with it, the daughter part of her and the CEO part of her, both processing the same information through entirely different frameworks, arriving at the same conclusion from opposite directions. "My father," she said slowly, "was not a perfect man. He was proud, and sometimes he was more loyal to relationships than to principles. And there were things about how he ran this company in the early years that I don't think he would have done the same way twice." She paused. "But he did not build a financial network designed to harm this company. Whatever the accounts show, whatever the documents say, someone used existing structures and repurposed them. That's not the same as intent." "I know," Daniel said. "And the evidence supports your read, not theirs." Okafor confirmed the original account structures were standard subsidiary financial management. They were converted, not created for this purpose. "So Whitfield is throwing my father's memory at the wall, hoping some of it sticks." "Yes." She looked at the letter again. Her jaw was tight. "He sat at my father's retirement party," she said. "He gave a toast. He stood up in front of everyone who loved my father, and he talked about integrity and legacy and what it meant to build something worth leaving behind." "I know. And he was already building this. We don't know exactly when it started, but it's possible, yes." She stood up, walked to the window. He gave her the time. This was the kind of thing that needed space to be felt before it could be managed, and managing it before it was felt was how people made bad decisions. After a full minute, she said, "What do I do? You call a press statement for this afternoon. You get ahead of it. You don't defend your father. You don't need to defend him. The evidence does that, but you address the attempt directly. You say clearly that attempts to shift responsibility to a man who cannot defend himself will be answered by the record, and the record is complete." He paused. "Then you get back to running the company. Because the best answer to this is the one you give every single day by doing the job the right way." She turned from the window. "Write the statement with me. I'm not a communications officer. No, you're the person in this building whose judgment I trust most. Write the statement with me." They spent 40 minutes on it. He drafted. She revised. He pushed back on 2 phrases that were too defensive, and she pushed back on 1 that was too aggressive, and they landed somewhere that was clear and direct, and said exactly what needed to be said without giving Whitfield's attorneys a single usable quote. At 3:15, Victoria read it to a small group of journalists in the company's main communications suite. Daniel stood at the back of the room. She delivered every word without a note, which she'd always been able to do once something was in her head, and she delivered it with the specific grounded authority of someone who is not performing calm, but actually possessing it. Afterward, one of the journalists called out, "Ms. Sterling, who prepared this statement." Victoria looked up from the podium. Her eyes found Daniel at the back of the room for just a fraction of a second. "I prepared it," she said, "with the help of someone who's very good at seeing the truth of a situation clearly." She didn't identify him. She didn't need to. He nodded once from the back of the room, and she moved on to the next question, and the room never knew the exchange had happened. But it had happened. That evening, Daniel picked Lily up from school. She got in the car and started talking immediately the way she always started talking immediately. And he listened, and at a red light, she stopped mid-sentence about Priya and looked at him. "You're different," she said. "Different how?" She considered it with the seriousness she brought to things that deserved seriousness. "Like you're more there. Like all of you is here right now instead of just most of you." He looked at his daughter. "You're too perceptive," he said. "I know," she said, completely untroubled by this assessment. "Is it the new job? Probably. Is it good? I thought about the last 3 weeks. About a department being rebuilt from the ground up. About Marcus 2 floors down, already reorganizing the internal audit structure with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting years for the right container for his particular skills. About Carla, who had walked past his office on his first day, stopped, looked in, and said simply, 'Good,' and kept walking, which was the highest form of approval he'd received from anyone whose opinion he respected. About Victoria, who was different with him now, not less professional, not inappropriate, but fully present in a way that people are only present with the people they've been through something real with. About a press statement written in 40 minutes that said something true. "Yeah," he said. "It's good." Lily accepted this with a nod and went back to the Priya situation, which apparently had developed new dimensions since that morning. He drove. He listened. He was completely there. 6 weeks after the gala, the federal case delivered its first concrete result. James Whitfield entered a negotiated plea. Not a full plea, the negotiation was still running on 3 of the 8 charges, but an admission on the financial structure and the coordination of the operation. It was in the language of the coverage that followed significant. In the language of everyone who actually knew what it meant, it was the first domino. Mitchell Dane's attorney reached out to Okafor's office the next morning. Richard Holt, who had been cooperating quietly since the night of the gala, was already in a different phase of the process, the kind where cooperation has been banked and is now being traded for specifics of outcome. Daniel learned about the Whitfield plea from Okafor directly at 7 in the morning, before most people at Sterling Global had arrived at their desks. He thanked her, sat with it for a moment, then forwarded the notification to Victoria with one line, "First one." She responded 3 minutes later, "I see it. Thank you." Then after a pause, "How are you?" He typed back, "Good." "You?" Her reply, "Better than I've been in 2 years." He set the phone down and went to his first meeting of the day. The morning that changed the final shape of everything came on a Thursday, 7 weeks after the gala, at the end of what had been an ordinary morning. Daniel was reviewing the revised vendor contract protocols with Torres when his assistant knocked and said Victoria was asking for him. He found her not in her office, but in the small room behind it, which he now understood was where she went when something was personal rather than professional. And the fact that she was there told him before she said anything that what followed was going to require the whole of him, not just the part that ran departments and filed documentation. She was holding a folder. "Okafor sent this over this morning," she said. "It's the final analysis of the original account structure, the one that goes back 7 years. She held it out. "I want you to read it with me." He sat down. She sat across from him. They read it together, which was a strange and specific intimacy. 2 people in the same document, following the same thread, arriving at the same understanding at roughly the same moment. The analysis was clear. The original accounts had been legitimate. Standard subsidiary structuring that Edward Sterling had signed off on in the ordinary course of running a multinational company. The conversion of those structures into the network that Whitfield had used had happened 22 months after Edward Sterling's death. Not before. Not during. After. Edward Sterling had not known, had not built it, had not looked away. He had simply at some point trusted the wrong people. And then he had died. And the people he'd trusted had taken the infrastructure he'd left behind and turned it into something he never would have sanctioned. Victoria read the final paragraph twice. Then she closed the folder. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "He didn't know." "No," Daniel said. "He didn't know." She pressed her hands flat on the table. breathed out. And for just a moment, a single human, unguarded moment, something crossed her face that was not the CEO, not the board presentation, not the press statement delivery. Just a daughter who had spent 7 weeks carrying the weight of a question that had now been answered. He didn't know, she said again. Not to Daniel, to herself. To something older and quieter than the room they were in. Daniel sat still. Let the moment be what it needed to be. He was good at that. Had always been good at knowing when silence was the most useful thing he could offer. After a long moment, Victoria straightened, pulled the folder closed with both hands, and looked at him with the clear, direct eyes of someone who has set something down and is ready to pick up what comes next. "Thank you," she said, "for reading it with me." "Always," he said. It was a word he didn't deploy lightly. He meant it. She nodded once. The professional surface returned, not as a mask, but as the natural expression of a woman who was ready to go back to the work, which was what she did with hard things, felt them completely, and then turned back toward the thing she was responsible for. "I have a board call in 20 minutes, she said. "I'll let you get ready." He stood up, moved toward the door. And then she said his name the way it had come to sound over these weeks, complete and specific, and carrying more than 2 syllables, and he stopped. "Daniel." He turned. "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it without redirecting it." He waited. "You came into this company with nothing. No title, no power, no one in your corner. You watched things that no one else was watching. You built something no one asked you to build. You carried it alone for 3 months. And when it mattered, when the moment was there, and everything was on the line, you were exactly the person the situation needed." She paused. "I don't say this as your employer. I say it as someone who knows what it cost, what it took. What kind of person does something like that?" Her voice was steady and certain. "My father would have been grateful. I am grateful. And this company, 11,000 people, who will never know your name, but will keep their jobs and their security because of what you did. They are the proof that what you are matters more than what anyone called you." He held her gaze. He could have deflected, could have made it practical, made it about the team, made it smaller than it was. He'd been doing that his whole professional life, making himself smaller, so the room felt comfortable, so the people with the titles didn't feel threatened, so the work could happen without the friction of being fully seen. He didn't do that this time. "Thank you," he said, and meant it without condition. She nodded. He walked out. In the corridor, he stopped for a moment. Not because he needed to, just because the building was moving around him, phones, meetings, the ordinary complex machinery of 11,000 people's livelihoods running on schedule, and he wanted to feel it for a second. The weight of what it meant that it was still running, that it hadn't stopped. Then he went back to work. Because that was what he did. That was who he was. The final turn of the story, the one that nobody had anticipated, including Daniel, arrived on the last Friday of the month, just before 5 o'clock, in the form of a meeting that Victoria had put on his calendar with no subject line, which was her way of saying it was personal. I went to her office expecting something connected to the ongoing legal process. Instead, Carla was there, which was unusual, and Harold Gaines was on the conference screen, which was more unusual, and there were 2 other board members he'd met at the first post-gala meeting, which told him the gathering had been organized, not spontaneous. He looked at Victoria. She looked back with an expression that was the most unguarded he'd ever seen on her in a formal setting. Something close to pleased, and something close to nervous, which was a combination he hadn't seen from her before. "Sit down," she said. He sat. Gaines spoke first in the measured, deliberate way of a man who understood that certain things should be said with the weight they deserved. "Mr. Carter, the board has been discussing your role here for the last week. Not the security department, your role. Specifically the gap you identified operated within and ultimately closed that our existing structure failed to provide for." He paused. "We'd like to formalize something." Daniel glanced at Victoria. She gave him nothing. Waiting. "We're creating a new position," Gaines continued. "Chief of Security and Risk Intelligence. Not a management title, a strategic one. It would sit at the executive level, reporting directly to the board and to Ms. Sterling. With a mandate that covers not just physical security, but the kind of institutional intelligence work that, as you demonstrated, can be the difference between this company existing and not existing. The room was quiet. Daniel looked at Victoria again. This time she let him see it. The thing she'd been holding back. The thing underneath the professional surface. The realness of what she wanted him to say. "This wasn't your idea," he said to her. "It was my idea first," she said. "Harold made it better." Gaines almost smiled. She's not wrong. Daniel looked at the screen. At the two board members. At Carla, who was watching him with the calm, unshakable patience of a woman who had already decided this was the right outcome and was simply waiting for him to arrive at it. He thought about a man who had once been told to worry about gas prices. He thought about a silver sedan and a dark blue car and 3 months of late-night work at a desk in a quiet apartment while his daughter slept 20 feet away. He thought about 5 words spoken into the ear of a man in a catering uniform 1 second before everything changed. He thought about Harold Gaines saying, "You protected something that wasn't yours. That's different. That matters." He thought about Lily at the drop-off line, turning back this time, waving with both hands. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll take it?" Victoria asked. "All right, I'll take it," he said. And Carla composed efficient 18 years of steadiness. Carla made a sound that was unmistakably the sound of a person trying not to show how pleased they were and failing slightly in the best possible way. That evening, Daniel drove home through a city that was the same city it had always been and felt somehow different. The way places feel different when you are different and can't separate your reading of the world from the state of the person doing the reading. He picked Lily up from after school. She got in the car, started talking, then stopped. "Something happened," she said. "A few things happened. Good things." Yes. She studied him with the particular forensic attention of a child who has learned to read her parent the way other kids read weather. Then she nodded, satisfied. "Tell me at dinner," she said. "After I tell you about Priya." "Deal." "Is the Priya situation more important than your good things?" "The Priya situation is always important," he said. She grinned and talked about Priya for the entire drive home, and he listened to every word, completely present, completely there, the way he had always been and would always be, not because it was easy, not because it didn't cost him anything, but because some things are worth the full price of your attention, and this was the most important one. At dinner, he told her what he could tell her, that he had a new role, a real one that mattered. She asked 3 questions. Processed the answers with the serious efficiency of someone who has a stake in the information and knows it. Then she said, "So you're not a driver anymore?" "No." "You're the person who makes sure the important people are safe." "Something like that." She nodded, picked up her fork. "You were always that," she said simply. "The job is just catching up." He looked at his daughter. This 9-year-old who was somehow already wise in the specific way that children are wise when they have been paying attention to the right things from the beginning. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right." She ate her dinner. He ate his. The apartment was warm, and the city was outside, and the world was the complicated, imperfect, necessary thing it had always been. And Daniel Carter, the man no one saw coming, the man they called worthless, the man who drove a car and watched and waited and built something alone in the dark because someone needed protecting, and he was the only one present enough to see it, sat at his kitchen table with his daughter and felt the full, unhurried weight of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Not perfect, not finished, not without cost, but whole. He had protected something that wasn't his. He had done it without title, without recognition, without anyone watching. He had carried it through 3 months of silence, and 1 night of noise, and 7 weeks of reconstruction, and he had come out the other side with his integrity intact, and his daughter safe, and 11,000 people who would never know his name still going home to their families every night. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole story, and it was true.